The National Museum in New Delhi is a fine repository of India's rich art heritage. This includes a large number of sculptures in a variety of media such as stone, bronze and terracotta, which were given shape and meaning by sculpting and modeling. These sculptures undoubtedly represent and reflect aspects of socio-economic life, religious beliefs, and culture of the people of the Indian subcontinent from the 3rd century BC onwards. The Archaeology Department of the National Museum, a connoisseur of this tangible heritage, is preserving these rare artifacts, enabling us to see and enjoy our glorious past. These sculptures are mostly remnants and loosened entities from the Buddhist, Jain and Hindu caves and shrines, like the Pitalkhora caves, Buddhist stupas at Bharhut, Sarnath and Sanchi, ancient Hindu temples of Khajuraho, and the Jain temples located in Rajasthan. Contrary to the Islamic and Sikh traditions, Christian churches, like that of Saint Cayetano in Goa, is beautifully embellished with sculptures in a harmonious sequence. The first gallery of the Archaeology Department houses sculptures ranging from the 3rd century before Christ to the 2nd century of the Christian era, from the domains of the Maurya, Shunga, and the Satvahana dynasties. The 4th century BC witnessed the rise of the Magad Empire, present-day Bihar, under the rule of Chandragupta Maurya. The Mauryan Empire expanded successively, but politically unified for the first time under King Ashok around the last quarter of the 3rd century before Christ. It was during this period that stone first became an important medium of Indian sculpture. 3 examples from Sarnath are displayed here. The Mauryans were the first to use art for imperial communication, as is apparent from the Ashokan pillars and their capitals, which are easily recognizable for their finely polished surfaces, a technique from the Achaemenid Empire. The ring stones and disc stones are the finest carvings in early lithic art. These are generally regarded as cult objects. They represent an extraordinary miniature world in itself, with intricately carved mythical and ritualistic motifs. Terracotta figures molded in lively and naturalistic poses form an important group of art objects of the Mauryan period. A few folkish terracotta objects of the Mauryan period are displayed in this gallery. The images of the mother goddesses were primarily hand-modeled, and ornaments were attached by applique technique. In 187 BC, the Mauryas were replaced by the Shungas under the accomplished leadership of Pushyamitra Shunga, and they established themselves as the chief ruling power in the central and eastern parts of North India. Their art was inherently folkish, indigenous, and generally in low relief. This period saw a remarkable development in Indian form of sculpture and ornamentation, essentially emphasizing the beliefs in folk deities called Salabhanjikas, Yakshas, and Yakshis. In the Shunga period, the sculptures were primarily used for decorating stupas, which are funeral mounds erected normally to enshrine relics of the Buddha, and were built at Bodh Gaya, Bharhut, and Sanchi. Most of these works of art depict scenes from the life of the Buddha and the Jatakas, which are tales of the previous lives of Buddha as a bodhisattva. It was during the 4 centuries of the prosperous Satvahana rule and their successors, the Ikshvakus of Vijaypuri, that most significant contributions were made towards the promulgation of the Buddhist art in Andhra Pradesh. The stupa at Amravati was built by the Satvahanas in the 2nd to the 1st century before Christ, while the art of the Ikshvakus at Nagarjuna Konda, a natural extension of the Amravati school, flourished in the 3rd to the 4th centuries of the Christian era. Intricate and detailed carvings of images, well known for their remarkable delicacy, softness, and their compact arrangement of visual narration of Buddha's life in symbolic forms, are the characteristic features of the Andhra art. The Satvahana artisans were also recognized for their rock-cut architecture and sculpture, as seen from a fragment of a stone carving from Pitalkhora, illustrating the great departure of Siddhartha, who was shown leaving the royal palace in search of the truth. The Kushans, originally a nomadic tribe from Central Asia, arrived in India around the 1st century before Christ and rapidly spread their rule across northern and central India. Under Kanishka, the greatest of the Kushan rulers of India, the simpler Theravada tradition, which was represented by symbols like the wheel, the footprints of Buddha, the Bodhi tree, all of which denoted the presence of the Buddha, underwent a transition which resulted in the iconic representation of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, coinciding with the emergence of the Mahayana phase. This period is also credited with the emergence of two distinct schools of art, one in Gandhara and the other in Mathura. The Gandhara art of Peshawar Valley is known for some of the most charming and magnificent sculptures in dark grey schist stone. Apparently, standing Buddha images were one of the most common subjects of artistic exhilaration during this period. The Gandhara school was undoubtedly influenced by the Greco-Roman art. Human figures appeared muscular, draped in three-dimensional folds, well-defined facial features, and wavy hair with moustache. The Gandhara sculptures introduced a new material called stucco, a mixture of lime and mortar for modeling and molding small sculptures. The Mathura school of art was apparently indigenous in nature, comprising Brahminical, Buddhist, Jain, and secular representations. The earliest known representation of this art, an inscribed figure of Bodhisattva identifying him as Maitreya, is depicted in Abhay Mudra, with the typical large nimbus, snail curl hair, and transparent garment clinging to the body. The double-faced relief depicting the drunken courtesan with attendants is considered to be one of the most magnificent secular sculptures in the gallery. In Western India, during the 3rd to the 6th century of the Christian era, the Vakataka rulers emerged as great patrons of religious art. The Shiva Vamana icon from the 4th to the 5th century of the Christian era from Mansa, and the massive standing Yaksha image of the 4th century of the Christian era from Sopara of Maharashtra are excellent examples of the Vakataka art. From the 4th to the 6th century of the Christian era, under the enlightened patronage of the Gupta rulers, Indian art attained the classical perfection of human form. The Guptas have been credited for cultural efflorescence in all spheres of art, and their sculptures are highly animated, youthful and expressive. Mathura and Sarnath were the two major centers for artistic activities. From the 4th to the 6th century of the Christian era, Mathura was the prime center for production of sculptures of all early religions. Concurrently, Sarnath rose to fame as another prime center of Buddhist art. The Gupta sculptures are noted for their calmness, an expression of inner tranquility, portrayed through delicately modeled oval-shaped heads and gently lowered eyelids. Standing figures in subtle robes reveal gracefully poised bodies. The great halos decorated with lotus flowers and other plants, and the hand gestures carved with utmost precision are typical of Gupta sculptures. The head of Buddha in buff chunar sandstone from Sarnath, dated 5th century of the Christian era, is one of the most outstanding sculptures of Indian art. It must have once adorned a life-size image of the Buddha. The head, with its finely worked out spirals of hair tied in a top knot or ushnisha, and ears with distended earlobes signify the Mahapurusha Lakshana. The benign glance with a concentration on the inner self and the well-composed face with the heavy eyelids is the high watermark of the sculptor's skill. One-faced and four-faced lingas are characterized by swelling forms and subtly carved heads of Shiva. Sculptural decoration used in temples was increasingly gaining popularity during the Gupta period, as seen in the nearly life-size terracotta images of Ganga and Yamuna, the embodiment of purity and devotion from Ahichhatra of Uttar Pradesh, dated late 5th to early 6th century of the Christian era. The two main river goddesses usually flanked the entrances of many Hindu temples. The costumes have heavy drapery folds and tight bodices and fully modeled facial features. Both the goddesses are easily recognized by their respective vahana or vehicle. Goddess Ganga is seen standing upon a makara, a beast that is a unique formation of half crocodile and half elephant. And goddess Yamuna stands on a kurma or tortoise. After the collapse of the Gupta Empire, regional idioms and patterns of production in sculptural art became increasingly distinctive. The progression of medieval sculptural style lies in the historical and political factors, as well as in the changing nature of religious beliefs, emergence of cults, and changes in the social structure. In the Deccan, Hindu art received an enormous impetus under the aegis of the early Chalukyan king. They built some fine temples at Badami, Aihole, and Pattadaka. The figures, deeply carved in red, yellow, and grey sandstone, have dynamic and elegant postures, displaying a variety of iconic models. A large plaque from Aihole, depicting a pair of flying celestials, shows great balance in sculptural form. This illustration of a Puranic myth centering on Tripurantak, found from Aihole, dated the 8th century AD, is a complex composition in which the figural postures have been handled with absolute artistic fervor. Rashtrakutas perpetuated the artistic traditions instituted by the early Chalukyas. The sculptures were usually associated with Hindu and Jain rock-cut temples, such as Ellora. The postural elegance and the subtlety seen in this image of the Ganga from the 8th century is an example of the artistic height accomplished in Ellora. The Western Ganga rulers were great patrons of Jainism, as is evident in the colossal monolithic sculpture of the Saint Bahubali at Sravanabelgola. The Hoysalas, who succeeded the Cholas and the Chalukyas in different parts of Karnataka, built two temple towns, Belur and Helibid, in the 12th to the 13th century of the Christian era. The Hoysala art is known precisely for its detailed, intricate and fine handling of images and intense decorativeness of the treatment. This depiction of the huntress and the following composition with two musicians from the 12th century Helibid testify the abiding interest of the sculptor's choice of subjects, notably scenes from daily life. The rising interest in varied subjects of sculpting could not merely confine sculptors to the task of illustrating Puranic episodes, such as Krishna's Kalyadaman from Helibid of the 12th century. The Kakatiya sculpture is distinguished from the elegant postures of its figures. The extremely elongated style, pointed noses and chins, arched eyebrows, large breasts, slim waists, large earrings and other distinctive ornaments, and more so, the nearly impossible dance postures single them out as a remarkable illustration of the medieval Kakatiya style. This lintel, showing the Trinity Brahma, Vishnu and Maheshwara, with a symmetrically robust Maheshwara at the center, indicates the Saivite religious preference of the Kakatiyas, who succeeded the Chalukyas at Warangal in Andhra Pradesh in the 12th century of the Christian era. After the disintegration of the Gupta Empire, Gurjara Pratiharas rose to prominence. They ruled from the 8th to the 10th century of the Christian era, with the epicenter in Kannauj, where sculptural activities took mainly two distinct directions. In Rajasthan, the sculptors increasingly developed a style of intricate and detailed carving, coupled with decorative designing of composition based on floral and vegetational motifs. While the sculptors from the Ganga-Yamuna Doab delicately crafted the human bodies as more curvaceous and sensuous by accentuating the Abhanga and Dvibhanga postures. This 8th century lintel from Chittorgarh of Pratihara era depicts Navagraha on 9 planets with Apsaras and Yaksha dancers accompanied by musicians. The carving in the lintel is intricate and detailed with elaborate composition, yet uncomplicated. This Nataraja or dancing Shiva from the 9th century Chittorgarh, though not intricately carved, yet is methodically composed in Dvibhanga posture, which highlights rhythm of the body in movements. Kalyana Sundara image of the 9th century from Bharatpur deserves definite attention. The image construed through an impeccable juxtaposition of postures of two figures to visually objectify their relation. The image of lady playing with balls, found from the Gohila Rajput region of the 11th century, is that of a peeping Tom gaze of a woman enjoying leisure. It is really absorbing and insightful to observe in this standing Neminath figure of the 11th century from Rajasthan how Jain iconological concepts have helped to delineate sensuous representation of nude human figures. The earlier Maitraka phase shows the predominance of Gupta features with increased emphasis on fullness of form, particularly in the schist sculptures from sites such as Samlaji. Austere simplicity that is noticed in this Adinatha icon emanates an impression of Jainism, which is more than the Chalukyan art as a whole. For capturing gracefulness and form, the sculptors of India from the proto-historic times have invariably turned to youthful female form, and for graceful rhythm to mudras of dance, as this bejeweled Mohini image from Karnataka of the 11th century invariably proves. Dance had also become a source for imparting rhythm to figural poses and movements of male divinities, which has been clearly portrayed in this Bhargava from Mysore of the 12th century. The art of temple sculpture in Madhya Desha reached its zenith at Khajuraho during the rule of the Chandelas between the 10th and the 12th century. The image of Yoga Narayana in Dhyana Mudra is from the 10th century Khajuraho. This image of Lakshmi and Narayan seems to be more like an amorous couple rather than divine entities. The rise of Pala dynasty in Bihar and Bengal began during mid-8th century of the Christian era and advanced its supremacy under the reign of Dharmapala and Devapala. The influence of Buddhism was clearly marked in eastern India, particularly through the two great Buddhist universities, namely Nalanda and Vikramshila. These two prime centers of learning had exerted profound influence on the whole gamut of sculptural trends of that era. During Dharmapala's reign, there were still signs of post-Gupta idiom influencing the work of that period, such as visible emphasis on slender bodies and general elegance of form, posture and movements. But the changes in the expression became transparent in the first half of the 9th century AD, with the emphasis increasingly laid on the solidity of form, fuller countenance, elaboration of composition with introduction of subsidiary figures as well as enhanced decorative pedestals and stele. A number of stone slabs were adorned with minute jewel-like carvings of figures. An image of Kali furnishes a marvelous example of how the artists were able to combine ferocious and compassionate moods into the same image. Other images include representations of Vishnu, Surya, Tara, and the Buddha. In Orissa, the Eastern Indian style is well illustrated in the carvings that adorn a superb group of Hindu temples dated from as early as the 11th century. Utkala and Kalinga, both the cities maintained a continuous progression of temple sculpture, which reached its pinnacle in Konark in the 13th century during the reign of the Eastern Ganga king Narasimhadeva. This is the last temple dedicated to Surya. The Surya image, which was placed inside the now ruined Sanctum Sanctorum or the Garbhagriha of the Surya temple situated at Konark, is regarded as one of the great sculptural treasures of the National Museum. This central figure stands on the Triratha base. Surya is flanked at his mid-height by two of his wives, Chaya and Suvarchasa, and lower down by his male attendants, Danda and Pingala. The beginning of stone sculpture in South India dates back to the period of the Pallava rulers, who adorned rock-cut sanctuaries with numerous Hindu deities. The typical features of the Pallava style include varied sculpture postures of tall, elegant figures, high crowns, and often crowded and animated compositions. Temples at Mahabalipuram and Kanchipuram are ornately embedded with such figures. The detailed treatment of the narrative comprised heavy body of Vishnu with flat planes on the top, as in wood carving, stands in sharp contrast to the fine chiseling of the contour of Agni. This essentially gives the figure a linear definition and modeled body. The Vijayalaya Empire was established by the Cholas during the 9th century in Tamil Nadu. The sculptural style during the closing years of the 9th century AD is usually referred to as Pallava Chola transition phase. Though Chola sculpture owes much to the art of the Pallava period, nevertheless, the Chola art comes out as a distinctive form. It developed a brilliant style of its own, particularly in its earlier phases. One of the salient characteristics of the Chola sculpture in general is much tighter modeling and ornamentation of the body, and more rounded faces than seen in the Pallava sculpture. The tendency towards using considerably tall headgear in Pallava art also tends to disappear in the Chola period. This Ayyanar or Hariharputra icon, sculpted in the 9th century, is an example of the early Chola art. The treatment of the body is simple, which enhances the linear definition of the figure and its posture. The characteristic features of this Chola Dwarapala from the 10th century may be noticed along with the figural poise. The heavy-handed treatment of the body of this Dwarapala may be compared with the stylistic treatment of the 12th century Dwarapala from the same region to get insight into the developmental direction of the Chola art. The later Dwarapala's bodily posture is more intricate and detailed with ornamentation adorned to the total discourse. It is Rajaraja, builder of the Brihadeshwara temple of Tanjavur, the greatest shrine in the south, and his son Rajendra Chola, to whom we are in debt for most of the masterpieces of Chola sculpture. The images of late Chola period are inclined more towards mechanical composition and often devoid of any genuine artistic merit, accordingly degenerating into mere icons. The rise of the Vijayanagar Empire in the 14th century of the Christian era eventually ended the supremacy of other powers in southern India. The imperial style of the Vijayanagar period borrowed many features from the Chola sculptures. However, the art of the Vijayanagar period, in comparison to earlier southern dynasties, is neither so expressive nor possessing the earlier simplicity and dignity of form and posture. The figures were large and tall to match the style of the increasingly tall gopurams or temple towers. Vijayanagar icons are known for their clearly defined, minute detail and formal correctness. National Museum possesses a few elegant but rather stiff sculptures from the Vijayanagar era. The icons of Narasimhavatar and Saraswati are fine examples of sculptures of that period. Even after the fall of the great Vijayanagar Empire, when its provincial governors, the Nayakas of Tanjavur, held independent sway over the territories they governed, there was not much improvement. This supine figure of Ranganatha is perhaps symbolic of the artistic decline that characterized the twilight and dying out of the Vijayanagar Empire, emphasizing beyond doubt the glory and artistry that was and perhaps will never be again.